In 1981 San Francisco, Chris Gardner sold a portable bone density scanner and dropped his son, Christopher, at an affordable daycare in Chinatown. He talks to a janitor about cleaning up profanity and notices a misspelling in the daycare's motto. While waiting for a bus, a homeless man mistakes his scanner for a time machine. Chris visits hospitals to sell the device and asks his wife, Linda, to pick up their son despite her long shift. He needs to sell 2 scanners monthly but hasn't made a sale lately. That evening, Chris spots a Rubik's Cube at dinner. Linda asks about their unpaid taxes, and when Chris mentions needing an extension, she gets frustrated and leaves for work. He struggles to solve the cube. The next day, he meets a stockbroker who explains that success depends on maths and social skills. Afterward, Chris wonders why he isn't as happy as others. The following morning, Chris tells Linda he wants to apply for a stockbroker job, but she thinks it's a bad idea, leading to an argument about their rent. He goes to a brokerage firm, but leaves his scanner with a street performer, warning her not to steal it. Inside, he learns about the application process, but rushes out when he sees the performer running off with his device. Despite a long chase, she escapes on a train. That night, Chris returns home upset about losing the scanner. The next morning, he sees a news report about a professor solving the Rubik's Cube. As Linda leaves for work, she asks him to return without the device, and he promises to sell it. On the way to daycare, Chris discusses the misspelling in the motto with his son and learns the daycare shows TV instead of teaching. He confronts a nanny about late payments. Later, he submits his application at Dean Witter Reynolds, but his conversation with Jay Twistle is brief due to Jay's busy schedule. After leaving the office, Chris spots the street performer with his stolen medical device. Furious, he chases them, but she jumps on a bus to escape. After a determined pursuit, he retrieves the device. At a bus stop, his son, Christopher, reminds him to sell the machines. Later, Linda finds both devices at home and is disappointed. Chris tries to explain the earlier incident, but Linda is uninterested and no longer trusts him. He then sees Jay hailing a taxi and reminds him about his application. In the cab, Chris discusses his skills while Jay focuses on solving a Rubik's Cube. To grab Jay's attention, Chris offers to solve it. Skeptical, Jay hands it over, and the taxi driver listens closely as Chris explains the puzzle. Jay jokes about driving around just to watch him solve it. Before they reach their destination, Chris impressively completes the puzzle, but Jay leaves him to pay the fare. With only $5, Chris asks to be dropped off a few blocks away. At a red light, he tries to escape, but realizes he forgot his medical device and rushes back for it. The driver chases him, threatening him. Chris jumps onto the subway but loses the device when the doors close on his hand, leaving it behind. A homeless man picks it up. That evening, Chris calls Linda to apologize for not picking up Christopher from daycare. Upset, Linda tells him she and their son are leaving. When Chris arrives home, he finds them gone. The next day, Chris meets Linda as she drops off Christopher. She shares her unhappiness, and Chris agrees to let her go, but insists she can't take their son. Later, he picks up Christopher from daycare before Linda arrives. That night, the landlord asks for rent, and Chris promises to pay later. The landlord suggests moving to a motel to save money, and demands he leave by morning for painting work. Chris pleads to stay longer, offering to paint the apartment himself. The landlord agrees to give him 1 more week. The next day, while painting, Chris hears a knock and finds 2 policemen who take him to the station. There, he pays his parking ticket, but learns it will be verified at 9:30 a.m. With no options, Chris calls Linda to watch Christopher while he's gone. She agrees but says she'll return late, so Chris spends the night at the station. The following day, Chris rushes to his interview at Dean Witter Reynolds in the same clothes as the day before. Embarrassed, he hesitates when the secretary calls his name, but eventually enters. The panel is disappointed by his appearance, and Chris bluntly explains he was arrested for unpaid tickets. Despite this, his communication skills shine, and he makes them laugh, easing the tension. Afterward, Jay congratulates him, but Chris worries about the 6-month unpaid internship. Jay encourages him to keep pursuing it. On his way home, Chris considers the job's risks. No salary for 6 months, and only 1 intern will be hired. His only resource is his 6 scanners, which he can still sell. Later, Linda tells Chris she plans to move to New York to work as a waitress. Chris agrees but insists that Christopher stays with him. Tearfully, Linda leaves, The next day, Chris and Christopher move to a nearby motel with help from a friend who owes him $14. Since it's Saturday, Chris takes Christopher to play basketball before selling a bone density scanner. Christopher shares his dream of going pro, but Chris suggests he aim for something more realistic. However, he encourages his son to pursue his dreams. They go to a hospital where Chris sells the scanner, providing some much-needed cash. When cashing the check, he lets Christopher buy a chocolate bar. The next day, Chris begins his internship and learns the trade. The coordinator stresses the importance of attracting clients. During lunch, Chris sees Mr. Fromm, but their chat is interrupted when Chris spots his lost scanner. He chases a homeless man carrying it, but gets hit by a car. The driver checks on him, and Chris realizes he's lost a shoe. He limps back, navigating the city for the rest of the day with one shoe. Chris feels undervalued as his internship coordinator constantly orders him around. Each day, he rushes to catch the 4 p.m. bus to pick up his son from daycare. At the brokerage, interns contact potential clients to reach CEOs. Although they're expected to stay until 7 p.m., Chris can only work 6 hours daily due to childcare. As he rushes out, his internship boss asks him to move his car, but Chris explains he has a meeting. The boss insists, wasting Chris's time as he fumbles with a jammed door and searches for parking. Unable to find a spot, he drives his boss's car to Ribbon's office, but gets stuck in traffic and misses the meeting. On his way back, he finds a parking ticket under the windshield wiper. That night at a diner, Chris writes a check to pay his ticket and invites his son, Christopher, to join him for a business meeting that weekend. The next morning, as they head to Walter Ribbon's house, Christopher asks about the game. Chris knocks on Mr. Ribbon's door, thanks him for the previous day's opportunity, and lies about their plans, claiming they were visiting a friend nearby. Mr. Ribbon invites them to join him in the box seats for the game. To maintain appearances, Chris hides the fact that he doesn't own a car. During the game, Mr. Ribbon expresses that he likes Chris, but won't accept his offer. Nevertheless, Chris and Christopher enjoy the game while Chris networks with Mr. Ribbon and his associates. After 4 months, Chris has sold all his scanners, just managing to survive his internship. However, his situation worsens when the IRS seizes his bank account for unpaid taxes, leaving him broke. Desperate, he asks a friend for the money he's owed, but the friend believes the debt was settled when he drove them to the motel. Frustrated, Chris argues until the friend slams the door. Later, while watching Christopher play at a playground, Chris spots his lost medical device with a homeless man and successfully retrieves it. The man starts shouting about needing the time machine to see Jimi Hendrix. Chris and Christopher rush to sell the device, only to find it's broken, though the hospital promises to pay once it's repaired, leaving Chris devastated. That night, they return to the motel to find their belongings outside, and the lock changed. Exhausted, Christopher cries to be let in. Desperate, Chris knocks on his friend Wayne's door, but Wayne won't answer. They end up at a train station, where Christopher points out that the device isn't really a time machine. To cheer him up, Chris pretends it is and acts as if they've traveled back to the time of dinosaurs, suggesting they hide in a cave. They move to the bathroom to play, spending the night there. While Christopher sleeps, Chris quietly cries, feeling overwhelmed. Chris and Christopher try to find shelter at a homeless center, but are turned away because it's only for women and children. A staff member directs them to another shelter a few blocks away. After waiting in line, they almost get denied entry because the shelter is nearly full. But they secure a room when security catches someone ahead of them trying to cheat. In the shelter, Chris tucks his son in and tries to fix the broken scanner, discovering it has damaged parts. One day, they attend a mass at the shelter, and afterward, Chris studies for his internship exam. The next day, he finished the exam quickly to join the line. On his way out, Mr. Fromm, stepping out of a taxi, asks Chris for $5, having forgotten his wallet. Despite his limited funds, Chris helps him. That night, Chris and Christopher arrive late to the shelter and must find another place to stay. To earn some money, Chris donates blood and buys a part to fix his device. The next day at the shelter, Christopher asks if Linda left because of him. Chris reassures him that's not the case. After tucking Christopher in, Chris successfully repairs the scanner. He sells it the following day, earning enough money for 4 more weeks. The next morning, they escape the city by going to the beach. Over time, Chris secures contracts with several of Mr. Ribbon's friends from the football game. Later, on his last day of the internship, Jay congratulates Chris in the bathroom for securing many clients, making it feel like a farewell speech. Chris is then called in by his internship coordinator to meet Mr. Fromm. Noticing Chris's new shirt, Mr. Fromm comments on it. Chris explains it's his last day as an intern, and Mr. Fromm hopes to see him wear it again tomorrow for his first day as a full-time employee. Afterward, Chris walks out, reflecting that this part of his life is happiness. He picks up his son from daycare and embraces him tightly. Chris later established his investment firm, Gardner Rich, in 1987. The scene ends with Chris and his son walking together, joking and enjoying each other's company as the real Chris Gardner walks by. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.